So who am I and why should you listen to me after that little bit of self-deprecation? So I told you about Slack, but actually before this, like a lot of you, I've only ever worked on consumer businesses. This is my first ever B2B company at Slack. I joined because it was one of the few products that I actually used every day and loved and just felt like I had to be a part of it. So I just kind of took whatever job they would give me at the time. In the past, I've done leadership jobs at a bunch of different consumer companies like Zyngo. I got there through an acquisition of a game company I worked at. Runkeeper, where I was the VP of product, and Instacart, where I built one of their first growth teams. That said, I've never done what most of you are doing, which is founded a company and sort of tried to get it off the ground. So what I want to talk about is sort of what happens after you have that product market fit. You kind of know it's working, and it's time to really scale a meaningful self-service business. So 4 things I'd like you to take away. If I am successful today, you will take away these 4 things. So I'll just start with them, and then we'll talk about them. The first is that self-serve is more than just a go-to-market motion. Second, that we should, because of this shift towards self-service and more of the model of like long-term freemium and these kinds of things, we have to think about loops and systems and journeys and life cycles and not funnels. Like David sort of talked about a little bit around salespeople treating it as like, pick up the phone, if they don't answer, quit, we're done. That's the funnel thinking. We have to think in terms of loops now, in terms of pools, in terms of usage, engagement. Third, I'm going to talk about the 3 meaningful levers for growth that I believe are the highest leverage points that you should be thinking about as you build a self-service business: activation, conversion, and expansion. And last, how we connect the dots to sales, because I think there's a lot of mythology around pure self-service businesses, but the reality is, in the future, most businesses like these are going to end up being hybrid models. And so what does that mean? And what can you do in your self-service product thinking in order to help that happen at scale? And hopefully along the way, I've littered in a bunch of examples, lessons learned, things we've done that hopefully you can take home and maybe try. So of course, this idea of product-led growth is super hot. There's tons of different companies trying these kinds of models, including many of you here. It's like really hot. It's so hot that people just kind of talk about, this is a tweet I saw the other day that really resonated with me, which is lots of people are going to tack on a shitty freemium version, say they're doing product-led growth, and really it's the old playbook. So how do you avoid that? There's a company that did this more recently, about a year ago, which is probably the most egregious example of this, which is Microsoft Teams. I have to take a dig at Microsoft while I'm here, which is Microsoft Teams released a free product, and let me guarantee you I've tried this. This is a great example of just slapping a free version and hoping it'll work. This is not a meaningful driver of anything for them. I don't think anybody uses it. At the end of the day, they're selling into their existing O365 customer base. This is following. I don't want you guys to do that. I want you to think deeply about how to connect the dots, how to make this a real part of how you think about product. And so the main way I like to think about this is what I call, like, you've all heard of product market fit. Some of you have hopefully heard about product channel fit, which is about growth and how you acquire customers, where you get them from. But the thing I like to focus on, and if you were at my talk last year, I used this slide as well, is model product fit. How does your business model fit your product, fit your customers, fit the market, and sort of fit together into a single cohesive piece? The thing about self-service businesses at the end of the day, about product-led growth, about this new era of enterprise that we're in, is that there is a convergence in terms of what marketing used to do, sales used to do, product used to do. There are no longer separate functions. They're all part of one system, and product is really at the center of that. And so that's what I've spent my sort of career learning how to do and building, and hopefully something to teach you. So I think the first rule is what I call people who give a shit but don't give a shit. They give a shit about their work. They care about using new tools. They care about trying new adoption, but they don't give a shit what their company has to say, what their IT people have to say, what their bosses have to say. Think of this as like the pirates, your early adopters. Have you built a product, and do you have a market of people who actually care enough to turn something on their own? I think this is one of the biggest missing bits here, and I think in a lot of markets, I'd add a little bit of a third rule, which is, and if they say they want something, the company will listen to them. This is why developers have been such a great market for product-led growth, and why they've been a great beachhead, because they're expensive, they're hard to recruit, they're hard to hire, and companies care what they have to say. That's not necessarily true in every part of the organization. So I think there's ways in which you have to think about, does my product fit one of these pirate personas, at least early on? The second criteria is that your product needs to be easy to get started. And the way I like to think about this is the value you get from the product versus the effort you've put into it. A lot of traditional enterprise products and a lot of the products that have tried to build self-serve models really do have long implementation cycles, right? You have to get all the data set up, you have to integrate it into your existing systems, you have to do some custom work, those kinds of things. I think that those kinds of things do not lend themselves necessarily to product-led growth or self-service business models. I think the best ones are the ones that you can get to at least some value early and quickly, and then that value builds over time. So that's criteria 2 of how you have to build your product in order to enable these models. And then the next one, I think David spent a lot of time talking about this, which is this idea of viral internal growth. And I actually think it's an either or. I think it's either you have viral internal growth or you're basically impossible to remove once it's in. And so my example for the difficult to remove, Stripe's not really a viral product, at the beginning, but once you're collecting payments with it, it's basically impossible to take out of the mix. Same with a Twilio or other things like that. Developer products tend to be on the difficult to remove side, but I think a lot of collaboration, productivity, et cetera, it's not that hard to remove Slack, but it is really viral and it's driven adoption across the whole organization. And so it becomes difficult to remove because of the footprint it's created inside of the organization. So which one of these are you? And ideally both. I think this is why you're seeing, a lot like system of record type or things that are both collaboration and documentation, Notions and Dropbox Paper and those kind of things kind of have both qualities, which I think makes them really interesting, but also hard to get off the ground. So just to drive home the example, think about AWS, which I actually think is the king, most amazing, probably largest self-service business ever created in the history of mankind. It is end users who give a shit, developers, versus I think in the old days of I'm beating up on Rackspace. I don't know a lot about them, but I'm using the caricature of Rackspace in pre-AWS days. I'm sure much has changed since then. But developers versus system administrators are just people who are not involved in the core product development process. It's easy to get started. Instead of having to make a phone call or get some install hell to get the right software on that box, you can just run some shell scripts and copy an AMI from somewhere else. And it has natural expansion. For them, the virality is not towards people, but towards more services. Things like S3, EC2, EBS, all these things are deeply integrated into the AWS ecosystem, and it makes it that it is both hard to remove and very viral. Versus if it's just a box running software that you've built, installed, and put there yourself, you can probably just build, install, and put it in a colo somewhere else and do it and move it somewhere else so it doesn't have that switching cost. And so I think this is a lot of a good example of why AWS has been such a juggernaut of business. So I'm done kissing the butt of the person who gave us this room. Let's move on. So I think the main takeaway I want you to have from this is not these individual lessons necessarily, but that you need to design a customer journey from the ground up for self-service adoption. And this is why our team for a long time was called Lifecycle, because it was about the lifecycle of a customer and how those individual people and their teams and their organizations use the product over the course of time and how we build a flywheel around that. All right, talking fast. Next thing. So, step 2 is funnels. I love this quote from George Box. He's a statistician. It's that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think the same thing, it's true for funnels. All funnels are wrong, but some of them are useful. But I think they're less and less useful these days as a way to think about how people adopt, sell, and use products. So I'd like you all, if you've ever heard of this traditional marketing funnel, the awareness, interest, consideration, intent, evaluation, purchase funnel, this is just you should erase this from your mind. Because it has nothing to do, especially for self-service products, how enterprise software is adopted, or at least product-led growth software is adopted these days. The fact of the matter is that if you think about a viral product or how you first used some of these things like Slack, did you research the problem you were trying to solve, identify the different options, and then do it? No, you got an invite, you clicked on it, and you said, fuck it, I'll try this. Same goes with Facebook, with Pinterest, et cetera. That those normal models of marketing are actually pretty inverted and are very, very different today, and that different users are entering at different parts, maturity levels, at different parts of this funnel. And so it's not a funnel. You don't pass from one thing to the next or drop out. You're actually working in sort of a loop. You're thinking in terms of adoption. So why do I think the marketing funnel is usefulest for the modern B2B or enterprise software company? First, it assumes an individual customer. It assumes a single buyer with a single problem to solve who has researched it. It assumes that they've researched it. It assumes linear progression, call, prospect, no, click, not, I'm gonna keep using this and we'll talk again later kind of adoption. And it assumes this sort of these kinds of single linear forward progress sorts of things. And then to add to that, for those of you who come from a consumer point of view, who I think already have thought in terms of loops, adoption, retention, engagement, et cetera, you have to add the additional complexity of the fact that we cannot treat individual users independently. A user is not a user in the same way that they are in a consumer product. A person joining Facebook is a person joining Facebook. They have to add 7 friends. Yes, there's some complexity about whether their friends are there and whether they're in a country that has adoption or not. But at the end of the day, they sort of run through the same system. Whereas 100 users on a single organization is very, very different than 100 first users at 100 organizations, which is different than 10 users each on 10 teams at a single company. And you have to think about these levels of complexity, that people are not just people using a product independently. They are parts of teams, they're parts of companies, and there's lots of interdynamics, as David also pointed out, around how they interact with buyers, how they interact with decision makers, how they interact with their managers, with their peers, across organizational boundaries, both internally and externally. And I think that these things are really important. And so this is why I like the concept of a loop instead of a funnel for these kinds of ideas. So let's just look at, this is a super simplified version of the loops that drive Slack. At the end of the day, you have both users and teams, and users are parts of teams. And so a team decides to try Slack. Somebody at that team decides to try. So I go to slack.com because I heard about it from a friend. I type in my email address and I try and I decide to pilot it with a couple of people. I invite a few people. That kicks off a loop for 3 different people who have to join. They have to activate, they have to start using, they have to start doing work in Slack, and then they invite more people. But then over time, those loops build, and our group is going to commit to using Slack. We're going to make a real commitment. This is how we do work now, right? They're going to change their behaviors. They're going to bring everyone else on that team into it. But then maybe there's an expansion that occurs because now the engineering team is using it. Well, we should probably add the QA folks, or we should probably add customer support, or maybe we should add marketing. And so there are these ideas. Remember that while on a user level, you may be inviting individuals, at a team level, you may be inviting whole groups of people, and that those are different dynamics. And thinking about these things and really developing a sophisticated loop-based view of how your product gets adopted inside of an organization is an essential part of how you're going to develop and expand and drive growth to the $100 million+ ARR level that I'm trying to talk about here as the kinds of self-service businesses you might want to build. So I think the key thing about this next section, I'm going to talk about the sort of 3 points of leverage, is that as I was thinking about this talk, it was the metrics that are important for driving ARR at your organization. I thought, okay, I started out with okay, there's net dollar retention and there's cohorts and acquisition and retention. And I was thinking through all those things, but then what I realized is those are all the things that investors use to evaluate the health of your business, which is important, and you should care about it. But at the end of the day, they're actually just outputs. They're used because they work across every business, not because they're unique to your product and how these loops are developed. They're sort of the outcome. And so we can all look at an S1 and talk about gross margins and number of customers and dollars per customer and those kinds of things and ARR growth rates. But it's hard to operate a business that way. And at the end of the day, we don't operate our business that way. And I would suggest that you don't. That there are important things to look at with your finance team or otherwise once you're building a scaled business to understand where you fit into the ecosystem and what kind of business you're building. But they're not the inputs, they're not the way you're going to build leverage, and they're not the way that you're going to drive growth. They're sort of the outcomes that you're going to get to. So, the 3 points of leverage that I want to talk about are activation, conversion, and expansion. So, and we'll go into each of these things. So, I know some of you are probably thinking, what the fuck? Really? You're just going to skip retention altogether? Isn't that the most important thing? And the fact is, it is. It is by far the most important thing, but I actually don't think, so I have a very unique view on this. I'm just checking for time. A little bit of a unique view on this, which is that there's not much you can do to change your retention except change your product in a meaningful or fundamental way. You sort of have what you have. And hopefully, if you're thinking about these problems, you're building teams to work on them. you're trying to accelerate and drive growth on your self-service business, you have this problem solved, licked, you have a strong understanding of it. I actually don't think your traditional growth, self-service type tactics are that effective for retention. They work in the margins, a couple percent here, a couple percent there, maybe new product launches drive it, but it's about fundamental shifts in terms of how people use your product or who's coming to your product. I don't think that's really about accelerating. So the reason I'm not talking about it is not because I don't think retention is important. It's obviously the most important thing, but because I think that it's really part of a different part of the journey. And what I want to like spend time on is like, okay, we have a thing. How do we really accelerate it, and where should I be spending my time and effort? Make sense? Cool. All right. So the first is activation. For each of these, I'm just going to talk about what it represents sort of qualitatively and what you want to measure. And I think activation is the most interesting one because it's actually the one that's hardest to generalize because I think it has a lot to do with the actual product that you're using and the product that you're building. And the way I think about this is activation is split into two components. There's the setup, what's the basic information I have to put in to just like get going, and the aha moment. This is not unique thinking. You've probably heard about these things from elsewhere maybe. Did you get to first value? Did you see the first value? Did you get something out of it, ideally in a short amount of time? And so the way I think about activation metrics, I think a lot of people overthink these things and try to get to like the key predictor that I have a long-term engagement and retention in my product and these kinds of things. But I actually think you can take a much simpler view, which is think of it as a crap filter. If you don't activate, you're not going to be on the product anymore. Not if I do activate, I'm likely to be long-term retained. And the reason I think that is because it makes the second criteria a lot easier to get to, which is it's got to be fast, it's got to be something you can measure pretty quickly, and it's got to be something that gives you a sense of health, both of the people you're attracting to your product, your acquisition, but also of your product and whether you're building a great onboarding, right? And so you want high fidelity, and you want a lot of, if it takes 3 months to get to your like magic moment, it's kind of hard to like really build a product loop around it, right? So I like these things to just represent meaningful first usage. This is, at Instacart, it was super simple. You just placed your first order. It's like, that's like not that hard to think about. We don't have to get that fancy about it. There's plenty of other things we could do, which is like, oh, you placed your first order, you got all your items, and it was a 5-star. Sure, but like, okay, now only like 8%. That's not true for most people because there's so many criteria. And so you end up with a lot of people who never activate but are still retained, which is confusing to think about. I like to think about this as sort of the minimum bar. And the last one is actually important. I think a lot of teams get into a lot of mess when they measure ratios instead of the overall throughput. And what I mean by that is like the percent of signups who do this thing. That's important, and it's a sign of like the product versus the acquisition side. But at the end of the day, your business doesn't grow unless you have more activated teams, users, companies, et cetera. So really like keeping an eye on both is important. So for us, we've actually gone back and forth on this. Super simple Slack example. We've actually done a ton of different iteration on this and actually got to a very, very simple metric, which is a user is active if they come back twice in the first week. It means they cared enough about the product, they received a message, they responded to it to come back on 2 unique sessions, 2 unique days. Because we are building a daily engagement product that is 4 to 5 every work day activity. And the clearest sign that you've started that is you came back twice in 1 week. And a team is just a team with 3 activated users. Super, super simple, but actually works incredibly well. We're able to use this as a proxy for our early engagement. We can use it as a proxy for health, for our acquisition efforts, and we can actually move the thing. But what we're counting is not the percent of teams that get here, but just the total number each week. Because at the end of the day, if I improve that ratio from 30 to 55%, but I have half as many people like actually hitting that because I've borked the sign-up flow or we've acquired different customers, it doesn't actually matter, right? It's about throughput, and I think that helps you keep your acquisition work honest as well. So, lesson learned here. I think that great self-service businesses invest in their onboarding forever. Not just, I get asked this question all the time. Can I build an onboarding, get it right, and then just move on to other parts of my product? And I actually think if you want to build a sustaining, meaningful, $100 million plus ARR business, you have to invest in onboarding forever. And the reason for that is I like to use the analogy of a house in a neighborhood that has been left alone and nobody lives in. I used to live next door to one of these. And it was really remarkable. You sort of like, imagine that a house will just be a house and the things inside of it will just be the things inside of it and it'll just sit there. But the reality is like everything around it changes. The environment encroaches on it. And I think the things that change in a growing business are, one, your customer base is definitely changing, right? If you're growing, it better be changing because you should be attracting later adopters, different people, different countries, different places that require different onboarding. So you should be continuously iterating on it. Second, your product changes. You have new features, you have new experiences. I hope you're not just like shipping the same thing for forever, right? And you need to rethink how you position that product, how your marketing copy has changed. Are you creating a different category? You're talking about it differently, but also do you have different features that you've identified as more important than others? And so that I think a lot of teams forget that they've built an onboarding about what thing X, and then they shift a little bit to thing Y and forget to introduce it. Or even worse, leave their product feature introductions, we do this all the time, in the product, assuming everyone is a existing user, and then you just open Slack and it's like boom, 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 like all these things fly at you because it's like, oh, you've never seen shared channels before, a lot, those kinds of things. And then last is the environment changes. Your competitors change. What counts as good changes is actually the one that I think is the most interesting. The greatest design in the world from 2008 looks like trash today. These things are relative, and what counts as good, the bar is rising so quickly that I think you really do have to think about what a good onboarding means every single day. Also with your product experience, but think of onboarding as a key part of your product. At the end of the day, it's the only thing every single user is guaranteed to do once. So you should treat it accordingly. And I think if you look at the world's most successful self-service, both consumer and enterprise businesses, they all have permanent teams dedicated to this work. And it is our longest standing growth team. They have an infinite roadmap of interesting ideas to work on. You'll never run out of stuff to do here. So, a couple things that I think I've learned along the way, pitfalls I've run into. This one's an interesting one. You add a step to your onboarding, it adds drop off. If you measure how many people complete your sign up process, it probably goes down. It's very easy to say steps are bad, take less friction, lessons learned from consumer, this seems really right. But I have found, at least with Slack and also from talking to other folks, setup friction seems to be a lot less important in B2B products, primarily because you've been probably introduced to it from someone at work and you probably need it to get your work done, or at least it solves a meaningful problem for you. And so the idea that like an extra step is gonna make you just be like, fuck it, I'm never using this again is a little more naive than it might be for like a weird social network you've never heard of. But the product friction matters a ton. So if you can glean useful information that helps you drop a customer into the right place, that's actually usually a net win versus the opposite. So this is why I think getting a good activation metric, again, a crap filter, is sort of like bottom of the experience that means real value, that predicts retention in some way, is an important thing to develop and get a sense around. Because if you naively just measure things like sign-up flows, you're always gonna find yourself, you're just gonna remove stuff. You're just gonna take more stuff out. You're always gonna think less is more, less is more, less is more, and you're not gonna get to the real value of the product and really like help people solve real problems. And so this is why we do a lot of A/B tests on this. We measure all of them through the activation and the total throughput of teams, like how many people pop out the other side who are actually using this thing. Because we have found that when we use other proxies, and there are certain places where funnels make sense, sign up is one of them because you do actually just go through or die, that early funnel stuff tends to look good in ways that aren't really good down the line. And more work can sometimes turn into better outcomes. The other one is like tours are useless. I don't know. I've seen this in a bunch of different products. I think it's like a lot of people try them. Like, I'm going to show you where this button is, and that button is, and this thing is, and that thing is. And they don't tend to actually matter because I think that's not what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is get customers into the core value as soon as possible and have them experience that aha moment. So for us, the things that have worked are things like, what's a project you're working on? Let's create a channel around that. Not here's the button to create channels, and then you open and you're like, what the fuck is this? I don't even know what's going on. It's taking you from, on mobile, is like dropping you into an actual conversation with a real human instead of with like a robot that doesn't answer questions very well. Like these kinds of things, like just helping you drop into the thing where you're gonna get the best value is super important. And you actually like gain a lot. There's another, I don't think I had a slide on this. For viral products, you're lucky. The first person is the hardest, but the second person always has something to go to, which is the stuff the first person added. So how can you encourage that first person to create content, experience, setup, et cetera, that attracts others? This is why I think the activation metric is really important to think about, because that could actually hurt your throughput and sign-up rates for that first person, but dramatically help everyone who's inviting. So are those trade-offs worth making? And this is why I think this is by far, if you take nothing else away, focus on activation, develop a good metric for it, think about it, build a team around it, do it every day, never stop. Like that's the main, most important thing. Second one is conversion. This one's pretty obvious and really the same for everybody in a lot of ways, especially for freemium products. I'm just gonna assume a freemium product here just for the sake of simplicity. Most product-led growth companies have some kind of free. And to me, this is basically exactly what David was talking about. This really isn't about dollars. I added the second metric there, which is the ARR added from new customers. That really just doesn't matter at the same rate that just people paying money. Like how many people chose to spend dollars today out of our total pool of customers. So the way I think about this is there's really three pieces to an effective freemium sale. The first is activity. So do you have the fundamental activity that you believe is the most important for someone to do? So like for us, that's a core group of people sending messages, working in channels, right? Second, do those teams, the ones with that threshold of activity, have awareness? Do they understand what your product is, why they would pay for it, and what value they get out of it? And third, does the packaging, the pricing, et cetera, create an incentive to buy? Does the perceived value of what I'm paying for exceed the price that I believe I'm being charged for it? And how do you think about that equation? So, first one. Awareness turns out for most product-led people to be a black hole where they think, oh, I'm gonna build the most courteous, beautiful product that does all the right things. And what they do is they just keep the free product super, super clean. People will go to our pricing page. We used to have this adage of Slack, anybody who uses Slack for a long time will pay for it eventually. So we don't need to do a lot of stuff in product. Then we surveyed our customers. A huge majority, way more than 50%, said they didn't even know that you could pay for Slack. Literally didn't know it was a paid product. My favorite example of this is an iOS App Store review that said, God, I hope this product doesn't go away because I don't understand how they make money. We had over $100 million in ARR at that point. So just people are not, don't research, you have to put it out in front of them. And I think especially if you have a quota-based system or some sort of activity-based freemium, putting that quota, where you're at about it, what it means, how notifications around the fact that you've reached it, you've passed it, you're moving forward, is one of the highest leverage things you can do, is just drive awareness. Hey, from day one, this is a paid product. You're gonna pay about this much for it. Here's when you're gonna care, and here's how far along you are on that journey. This stuff is basic, simple stuff, and it can often be the highest leverage thing in terms of changing your rates. I mean, I can't get into specifics, but these kinds of things were game-changing, shifters for the business when we first started doing them. The way I like to think about this is every paid feature should have some kind of surface area in your free product, because it's actually more courteous to your customers to tell them the thing they're trying to do is possible, they just have to pay, than to have them imagine that you can't do it at all. This is another one. This is a lesson learned not by me doing it, but by having not done it at multiple companies, and it being incredibly painful. I suggest you experiment with your pricing and packaging early and get in the habit of it and be okay with it. The longer it sits around, the more impossible it is. I bet 70% of the people in this room know exactly what Slack charges, either because you've researched it and picked the same price for your product, don't do that either, or because you have seen it so many times. The fact is, these things haven't changed since the day Slack was launched. The rough price points, the rough what's in there. We've built new features, but I think the danger here is that if you stick with the same pricing and packaging, the same chunks for a long time, new features become the only leverage you have to change that last piece, the incentive to buy, the perceived value. New features become the only way to do that. Often that means bigger enterprise features for your largest customers, and you can end up abandoning some of your SMB customers. It also means that you just don't have, no single feature changes somebody from I'd rather stick with free to I'm gonna pay $1,000 a year. It's rare that that's the case. So you end up with a lot less leverage than you would if you were like, hey, let's try this versus that. Let's try this versus that. So get into the habit of playing around with stuff and trying new things. Be courteous to your existing customers. I think you can grandfather people in, but I think get used to it, at least culturally, so that you can move forward. And the last lesson that I have learned around this is that conversion velocity matters. And I think David got into this a little bit when he talked about trials versus long-term freemium. So here I've just put two theoretical products. One is in red, has some ramp up of conversion and then a slow slope to some value of what percentage of their paid or free teams convert to paid. And the other has a much quicker ramp, maybe slower at the beginning, but then a trial moment, like an expiration or something like that drives it up. And the fact is that the green business, even though they are at the end of the day, the same number of paid teams paying roughly the same amount of money, is a lot better business. It's gonna grow faster. You're gonna have way faster payback periods. So you're paid, if you are doing paid acquisition or other kinds of sales efforts, they can return much more quickly. And third, the fact is that data in the future is just a projection. The longer it takes for things to happen, the more likely it is they'll never happen because the environment changes, because your product changes, because they decide to move to Microsoft Teams or use a competitor or whatever it is or whatever new hot thing comes out. You create uncertainty for your business the longer it takes for a customer to become paid. And the fact is, this is another bonus tip, usually companies, the teams that pay have way, way higher retention and engagement. Seems obvious, self-selecting, but I do actually think there is an actual causal relationship between the commitment you make to buy a product and your usage and engagement and development of the commitment you have made and your willingness to continue with it. So I think faster is better. So if you see yourself with great conversion but these long, slow slopes, think about how you might redesign your packages to drive earlier conversion. Maybe you're giving away too much value. And then the last one is expansion. So what happens after a customer pays, where the real growth happens. I think this is one of the interesting things about self-service businesses is that a lot, at least for Slack, and I know this is true for other collaboration products, a lot of the growth in these organizations and these companies happen after that first sale. They happen after that because there's still virality going on. And so this, what it represents is the idea is usage. Is usage growing along the primary value dimension? So for Slack, this is active seats, right? Because we charge per active seat. At an API company, it might be number of API calls, it might be number of products used or something like that, number of integrations. It depends what it is, but is your usage actually growing? And this is why I think it's important to think about expansion not just in terms of dollars, but actually the core usage that drives those dollars at the end of the day. Because, again, your biggest customers are always gonna be the ones, you wanna look at the full system. There's a lot of black holes when you think just about revenue, especially in self-service businesses, around focusing on the high end of your business and then forgetting that the engine that created those comes from the bottom. That's the bottoms up thing. So this is why I like a lot of these seat-based or team-based metrics and user-based metrics versus dollar-based ones, because an enterprise plan paying 10 times as much as an SMB, it's always gonna be easy to prioritize those things and think about them, but you're building an engine. Adoption, so are you actually using those paid features? Are people using them? That's a good predictor of whether they're gonna stick around, whether they're gonna keep sitting. And then of course, upsell. So are you actually moving mature customers to higher price points? Have you designed your packages to sort of have consistent ladders, or are they clearly designed for individual segments? Both are fine, but I think you have to know which business you have and think about how you think about expansion that way. So the way I like to measure these are on the team side is the percentage of customers adding seats. So of my paid user base, how many are growing? How many are shrinking is a way to think about the accounting on that. And so you can, because that growing and shrinking is a sign of, it can be a helper for churn. Again, why don't I look at retention on paid stuff? If you're managing your usage metrics well, churn should be a no-brainer, especially for a freemium product. Because I bought the thing after a ton of usage, so the probability of me churning is so much lower. The second, on the user level, this one's really important. Are there paid users actually inviting other people? Are they inviting more people? So just think in terms of normal invite funnels. And of course, at the end of the day, it is important to also then think about the dollars and the ARR added from existing customers. So what is your expansion rate? These things all net out to net dollar retention, which is the investor metric. But net dollar retention is an amalgam of a ton of different things. It has weird long windows, those kind of, it's a helpful snapshot when you're raising around or trying to go public or whatever, but I don't think it's a good operational metric. It only tells you where you stand versus other people. So, this one's a great lesson. This one is a secret we just learned, and now I'm giving it to you all for free. Administrators are the enemy. They're the fucking enemy. They're like, once you sign deals, they're gonna try to block everything. Here's the most common feature request. Can you turn off X? Your default answer should be no, not yes, if you can. And so leave as much power as you can in the hands of your end users. At the end of the day, your end users are the ones who got you here, they're the ones that landed these accounts, they're the ones that are driving that usage, and those are your champions. And you have to help them be happy, you have to help them do their jobs. Your job at the end of the day, or at least for us, is to make people's working lives simpler, more productive. And if we take power out of the hands of the end users, we lose that. This one we just have started doing, but if you make a feature administrator only, make it clear to end users how to make that thing happen. So the best example, so IT always wants more control. Just don't give it up so easily. Because once you give it up, it's unreversible. Once you have turned off a feature, you've said, hey, this preference to turn off thing X that you don't like exists, guess what? It's never going away. You can never undo that change. Like, control is never given up, it is only given. So be really thoughtful about what you do and don't want as you grow into larger and larger customers, administrators to be able to do. So a good example of this is a this year thing, so you get to do this from the beginning. It used to be that most teams had a setting called admins only can invite to Slack. I'm sure most of your teams are set up this way. So I work with Michael, how do I invite him to Slack? I don't know. Who's the administrator? I don't know. How do I even tell that person who it is? I guess I have to figure out who they are. I have to send them a direct message. Hey, can you invite this person? And then they get invited, hopefully. No loop is closed. He doesn't know that I invited him. He knows that Lee invited him, who's the admin. He doesn't even know her, like those kinds of things, right? Like, that's not a loop. Like, this is why thinking in loops is so important. The loop that would make sense is I invite him, an administrator approves that request, he comes in and DMs me, hey, thanks for inviting me. That's the loop we've been able to create, right? But that took us time to really understand. This is one of the most meaningfully impactful. I've given away all of our most impactful experiments. This is one of the most impactful feature things that we ever did. And again, this isn't about little A/B tests, moving buttons around, adding the invite thing. All that stuff kind of does marginal stuff. It's about fundamentally understanding your loops and building against them and leveraging them so that you can be successful. And this is one of the most important ones. If you have core features that are admin blocked, find ways to make it possible for end users to take those actions. But that's on the self-serve side. Small businesses, they have these problems. But the reality is, and I got into this a little bit with the admins are the enemy thing, the biggest expansion opportunities are ultimately locked behind enterprise walls. We have done a bunch of analysis where we know the number of employees at companies, and if you take all the places we have paid teams and then say how many seats would we have if we just went wall to wall and didn't add any new customers, it's $40 gajillion of ARR or some absurd number, and that's because Walmart is massive, right? IBM is massive, these companies are huge, there's a ton of seat opportunity in them. But the fact is that self-service only gets you so far. I do think the world has changed since what David has talked about. People do pull out their credit cards and buy. There are empowered buyers inside of even the world's largest companies, but they can only get you so far. Little tidbit, we find that the average size of a self-service paid team is roughly the same regardless of the company size. The group of people making that first decision is about the same size, but the bigger companies have a ton of upside. So how do you get there? And I think sales is almost inevitable. One, because the key champions, the people that you have made pirates, and they are excited, happy pirates who want to win in their organization, they need and they want help to sell internally. You're not making a first sale. You're making the it's time to take this product seriously sell, which is a lot easier. It's more of a success motion in a lot of ways. Second, some people just want to talk to a human. Lots of people just want to talk to a human. They don't understand, they have random questions. And also, if you're doing this sort of pirate ship thing, you end up with a team here, a team there, a team there, a team there. Nobody knows about anybody else. You have 40 instances, and you got to do some unification. That becomes a real problem for IT at some point. And big customers have specific needs. You need to start prioritizing things like security, administrative needs, those kinds of things that small companies just don't care about. And there are laggards in every company. This one's actually the most interesting one for me, is that even if you have, a large company has everybody at every level of the customer like adoption lifecycle. You have early adopters, you have laggards, you have early majority inside the same organization. So who's going to help those different people make the same decision at the same time? At the end of the day, that tends to be a sales and success organization. But there's some pitfalls. So especially if you have a very large and SMB also focused self-service business with tens of thousands of freemium leads, let's call them, per week, there's no way you can build a human engine around talking to every single one of those people. So you have to do different things for different people. So the first thing I would suggest if you're getting to the point where you're starting to build a sales team is invest in good firmographic data so that you know who your customers are, who's signing up, who they are in their organizations, either through Clearbit or some other data broker. I think these things are important because you have to be able, I'll get to it in the next one, help people segment. The next is, this one's a simple win that we did. Basic notifications of key activity, purchases, growth, et cetera, that your AEs and the rest of your sales org can use as intelligence that things are happening in their giant book of companies that they're responsible for. So-and-so just paid $40 for 5 seats of Slack. Let's maybe just call and say, hey, can I help you in any way? That's a much easier call than like, do you want to buy Slack? And eventually you can use heuristics, data science, and those kinds of things, and we do now more of this now, to identify the key champions, the key people inside of accounts that are power users who are going to be your advocates, those kinds of things, and then help your sales team, again on the data side, communicate that. So I've heard that LinkedIn, for instance, has these amazing tools where they generate pitch decks automatically of like all your people at the company using premium LinkedIn products and how you would coalesce that. I know Dropbox does some of this. We are starting to do this. I think that becomes over time again, this is the responsibility. The reason I think this is the responsibility of the self-service business is because the people running the self-serve business understand the data, the users, the growth dynamics, the mechanisms for this better than almost anybody, and can be a source of intelligence to your sales teams about who they should spend time with and who they should talk to. And eventually you can break free of a one-size-fits-all product experience. So instead of doing, superhuman style like hand onboarding for every single person, maybe you do that just for the biggest accounts. Or maybe instead of doing self-service for everybody like we do, if you are the first person ever to sign up at a megacorp, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure you invite 3 people and are successful, right? Like, I think there are ways in which you can start to really think in terms of personalizing those experiences based on the future value, not the current value of those customers. And so what happens in this was one of the big impactful things we did when we first added a really great mid-market lead to our sales team, is defining clear segmentation and empower your customer support team to help down market. Early on at Slack, we had this sort of thing where like sales didn't want to miss anything. So they're asked anytime somebody contacted support and said, hey, I need some help, it would always go to the sales team. And unfortunately, these poor folks were like just bogged down with demo requests and these kinds of things that are actually just like at tiny companies or people who just wanted to talk to someone. And we didn't know how to manage that. So what we ended up doing was actually defining a clear segment line, clear set of rules. We empowered our customer support team to qualify those leads and pass them along based on a set of agreed upon criteria, based not just about company size, but also industry, depth of usage, those kinds of things. And then we trained those support teams to be able to make good pitches, descriptions, demos, and gave them the tools and resources they needed, the videos, the resources, the ebooks, et cetera, that they could send to those folks who we weren't willing to invest like meaningful sales effort into. And they become a primary lead source. So this is an important thing, because especially if you're building one of these like all the way from down market, like micro SMBs, all the way up to enterprise products, which a lot of collaboration products are. You don't get to choose who your customers and who your users are. You really do need to define clear flows, workflows, and sort of like criteria for passing things off and helping figure out like who's going to be pure self-service, who's going to be in the sales funnel, because these things are hybrid. So, went through a lot of stuff. Only 1 minute over. First one, self-service is more than a go-to-market. You can't just slap it on. You need to build your whole product in order to fit that thing. Second, think in terms of core loops and think big about how you accelerate those and make sure that adoption is being driven both for paid and free teams and how those things happen. Third, at the end of the day, if you want to build a meaningful $100 million plus self-service business, you have to start with activation, then you can focus on conversion, and third on expansion, and then fourth, the expansion model, the expansion at the end of the day becomes about how do you connect the dots between the self-service business and your sales motion. All great companies end up being hybrid in the long run.